Hello and welcome to Two Bi Guys. My name is Jacob Engelberg.
And I'm Rob Cohen, and thank you, Jacob, for guest hosting this episode. It's so nice to have you guest hosting.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure, and it's especially a pleasure to be asked to guest host with you this episode, because we have a very special guest who will be known to many of your listeners, I'm sure, and that is Shiri Eisner. Yes.
Well, you were the natural choice to host this one because while I've read her book and love her book, Notes on a Bi-Revolution, you brought her up multiple times in your interview last year on Two Bi Guys. And so I know you're very familiar with her work. And especially now she's doing more TV and film criticism sort of in your lane. So you did very much better than I would have done with this one. So thank you.
No, it's with Shiri's work. It's really the work that got me into thinking about this stuff and wanting to actually take stuff about bisexuality into the academic work that I was doing. But also, I think for a lot of people that have come across her book, it really kind of galvanizes us into thinking about politics through our bisexuality and bisexuality through our politics as well, in a way that can feel just quite it feels like a game changer the first time you encounter it, and I think both of us had a similar experience with that. So just to explain to people who Shiri is, Shiri Eisner is most well known for her book that Rob mentioned. It's called Notes for a Bisexual Revolution, and it came out in 2013. Shiri is a writer, an activist. She's based in Tel Aviv in Israel, Palestine, and her book has been incredibly kind of formative for a lot of bi people. And she kind of explains in our interview her rationale behind the book. And what I think she's really successful at doing is to do both a history of bisexual activism and bisexual identity, but also to draw almost a kind of map as to what a politics that is informed by bisexuality might look like. And that's the kind of part of her work that I find most exciting. How about you, Rob? What was your kind of experience of the book? What did you take from it the first time you read it?
Well, it's funny because I kind of didn't realize it came out in 2013, but it makes so much sense because I was born in 1985, and I remember being about to hit my 30th birthday. So it was 2014 probably. And I was like, shit, I have to address this. I have these thoughts and things I've been repressing. And like, I don't want to turn 30 and still be repressing it. So that was the time when I started like doing research online and really thinking about this. And I think a little bit later, starting to explore stuff. And so that was when I read her book. And I think that something that was so powerful about it for me was that it was connecting it to politics and to like radical progressive things that I was leaning towards already. But I think that really helped me to embrace it and to come out because it wasn't just about me. Like in a way, if it was just about me, it was harder. But if it was sort of connected to something bigger, then I felt, and it connected me to this community that it felt like something I could join and be part of. And I didn't necessarily have to like blaze a trail all by myself. It really so I think that's when I read it, that's what it helped do for me. And I don't know that I even realized like that it was a new book then, that the timing was so perfect. Because it was so helpful for me at that time.
And I think what you're talking about speaks to the experience of lots of bi people that we don't necessarily become aware, if we become aware at all, that there is such thing as a bi community, that there is such a thing as bi politics, bisexual history. and we need kind of these resources to lay it out, because it's not that apparent in our
Right.
day-to-day lives,
Right. Right.
and so many of us stay closeted throughout our lives, and a lot of that, I think, is around the fear of not having a sense of belonging, of not having
Hmm.
a sense of community. But the political stuff, I think, really relates to that, because what Shiri is kind of advocating for in her book is a version of politics that's based on community and solidarity, in ways that kind of individualized politics of kind of everyone's fending for themselves that we get today, in what might be broadly like discussed as neoliberalism. That's all about kind of fending for yourself. But what Shiri's book is so focused on is about solidarity between people,
Hmm.
and lots of people who've thought through bisexuality in terms of politics have talked about how bisexuality and its position in either in the middle of things or beyond a binary category actually has a really nice vantage point from which to see the connections between things that people think are separate. And
Yeah.
I think that that really informs the kind of radical politics of the book, which she clarifies at the beginning of the book. The radical is a scary word to lots of people, but literally what it means is like at the root. And she's talking about kind of tackling these problems at the root, and knowing that we can make political change that isn't about us fitting into some pre-established structure, but changing that structure itself.
That it's so interesting that everything you said makes total sense. I won't reiterate it, but I've been thinking all that. But like it is true. I never really connected with gay and lesbian stories. I mean, I connected a little bit
Mm,
with parts of it, but I didn't
mm,
feel like a deep connection to the history of it or the stories people would tell. And same with like trans identities and gender fluidity. Like it didn't
mm,
feel like me. However, when I read her book and some others and saw that bi is its own thing and I had that foundation, then
mm,
I could sort of make the connections and see what where the similarities were in the crossover. And I think her book, which has those chapters like bi and trans and other things,
mm,
really helps you see how solidarity is possible and why it is sort of fundamental and so important. And that once
mm.
you have your own identity, known and established, you really can bridge those gaps and really create a queer, solid movement. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think one of the kind of main takeaways from Shiri's book is a kind of desire to break down all kinds of binary structures. And just because the one that we're most familiar with is the sexuality binary, doesn't mean that that's the only one we need to care about. It's actually
Right.
one among many binaries that exist socially. And our familiarity with how inadequate that binary is can really inspire us to tackle the other ones as well.
Yeah. Absolutely.
But yeah, Sherry was a brilliant interviewee, easy to talk to. I think we were both a little starstruck. Would you agree?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, well, and also like I'm trying this guest host thing and I'm not going to attend every single guest interview, but this
Right.
one I was like, how can I not meet Shiri Eisner? She's going to be on this show. Like I have to go. So even though you, Jacob, took the lead and drove the interview, I had to be a little bit of a fanboy in the background, and I attended the interview and chimed in a little. And yes, I was quite a bit starstruck, but Shiri was so nice and down to earth and great, and
Yeah.
the stars are just like us.
They are. I'd say that there was a fanboy in the background and the foreground. So if we sound a bit sycophantic, apologies in advance, but her work means a lot to us, guys.
Indeed.
Well, without further ado, I think we should let everybody hear this interview we had with Shiri. We had so much to talk about. We're actually going to be splitting it across two episodes. So today you're going to hear the first half where we talk kind of specifically about those political ideas, and we also talk about television, which is very interesting. My area is film, which is definitely not divorced from from TV studies these days. But I think Shiri answers a lot of the questions that Rob had for me that I couldn't answer the first time round, which was like the kind of stuff that should maybe be being made right
Mm-hmm.
now, what we're lacking. So without further ado, we've got politics, we've got TV. Here's our interview with Shiri Eisner. So today I have the pleasure of interviewing someone who is such a big name in bisexuality in general, but anyone who has endeavored to kind of think critically about bisexuality in the past 8 years, think about what bisexual politics might mean, think about the connections between bisexuality and leftism, will have come into contact with the work of Shiri Eisner. So it is such a pleasure to introduce you today. And welcome to Two Bi Guys.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here.
So let's start off just by asking you what your pronouns are and how you identify.
I'm bisexual and genderqueer. I generally use she, her, and also accept they, them.
Great, thank you. And yeah, I mean the book that you're known for is by Notes for a Bisexual Revolution, which came out in 2013 with Seal Press. And I'm sure many of our listeners will have read your book or encountered it in some way, but I'm sure there'll also be many who haven't. So I was wondering if you could maybe give us a sense of what the book is about, what inspired it, and yeah, what your journey with it has been like since it came out.
So basically, this book is the book that I was always looking to read when I was just starting to get more knowledge and reading about bisexuality. I mean, there is a lot of really, really good bisexual writing, but it's kind of hard to come by. A lot of it is academic. Um, Activist anthologies from the 90s, there are a few of those, but I didn't feel that I could have like one place where the whole like theory and politics would be presented in a way that is both radical, intersectional, and cohesive. Because like you would get a lot of radical perspectives, of course, in some of the anthologies, but it was, isolated. None of them was making like a full comprehensive argument. So like, I don't know, it was like 3 years or 2 years I was going around telling everyone that I had a book in my head and one day I was gonna write it. After a while, there was one week. I talked to 3 people. It was my girlfriend at the time, a friend, and my therapist, and all three said, okay, you need to write it. So basically, the book is about the way I view bisexual politics, bisexual oppression, and bisexual liberation. I really wanted it to be both intersectional and radical in a way that would connect both of these ends, which don't meet often enough, which I think is so weird because they're so complementary. And, I always wanted to read a book that had, like, a section of bisexuality and feminism, and bisexuality and race, bisexuality and transness, and, all of those things. So, like, I went ahead and did it.
And it was a successful endeavor, I think,
Thank you.
because now we have this book, which is a brilliant guide and a starting point for people who are interested in learning about these histories, these ways of thinking. And I know certainly for me, when I came across this, I that kind of convinced me to research even further, look into some of those texts that you're citing, but also know what to work towards in terms of bisexual politics today. I'm wondering, Rob, for you, when did you encounter the book, and what was your experience with it?
I mean, there was a point in my journey where like I started to actually acknowledge my feelings of maybe being bisexual, and I then like started reading like everything I could find and everything I could get my hands on, and like I read a ton, and a couple things just made everything kind of make sense and made me realize, oh, this isn't like just about I have same-sex attractions. It's like about my politics and my identity and like how I see the world in a worldview. And it was your book that really helped me see that.
Thank
And
you.
I'm also so inspired that you were just like, I wanted to read a book like this, so I wrote it. I mean, that's essentially this podcast is like, I wanted to listen to stories of bi men and like hear more about this, and I couldn't find it. So Alex and I were like, okay, let's just do it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's also like really important politically that, we create our own texts and we write our own stories and um, put words to our life experience.
For sure. And you mentioned, Rob, the kind of desire for bi guys to kind of engage with that kind of specific experience. And the interesting thing about your book is it's some of the most kind of compelling ideas on male bisexuality that I've heard, which manages to explore it without falling into some of the essentially misogynistic trappings that can sometimes fall into. And the thing that I like that you talk about is that the kind of dominant idea of masculinity is associated with singularity in oneness. And the thing about bisexuality is it's an affirmation of a kind of multiplicity, a potential for multiplicity. And there is something in that where we can perhaps rethink modes of masculinity. So I basically just wanted to give you an opportunity to explore those ideas a little bit more with us, to think what a bisexual masculinity might look like, and its relation to feminism and the feminist project more broadly.
Yeah, I think, a lot of the times, or maybe less so recently, but a lot of the times writing about bi men and discourse about my bi men were focusing on, comparisons to bi women, like comparisons to bi women's visibility. A lot of the time, there would be like a sort of an accusation between the lines, like, why are bi women leading the movement? Where are all the bi men? With the insinuation that bi women were silencing the men. I have been seeing less of that recently, I'm glad to say, which is very nice. Thinking about men and bisexuality, I think bisexuality gives men a really great opportunity to step aside from masculinity as a dominant structure. Like, it gives a way to reevaluate the construction of what masculinity is and the requirements of society for men. And that just opens up a lot of options because, like, I feel men are often trapped in very rigid structures that, you know, society kind of locks them in. And of course, all of these rigid structures are meant to, qualify men to their role as oppressors. But that also very much harms men. It requires them to mutilate a lot of emotional parts of themselves and behavioral parts of themselves in order to, to fit the role. And I think, it's not just that bisexuality is outside dominant masculinity. It's also the fact that bi people in general can often experience what it's like to be at the bottom of the hierarchy, for example, in LGBT communities, or what it's like to be erased from culture. And I think that opens up also a lot of opportunity for solidarity with other groups and for a broader political understanding.
Absolutely, and I think it's something that is very different to the kind of politics that is like bi men can be just as masculine as straight men, or the kind of stuff that's like you spoke about those kind of accusations about kind of bi women leading the movement. Another one tends to be why are bi women accepted and by men not. And you make a very kind of clear point in your book that because something is palatable to patriarchy, a very specific kind of image of female bisexuality is palatable to patriarchy, that is not acceptance. And to have that kind of understanding that actually engaging with a kind of feminist critique makes for a more holistic understanding of the bigger picture, I think is so important.
Yeah. And I think that's also like part of the opportunity to step aside from dominant masculinity is, to be in solidarity with bi women, and with bi, trans, and non-binary people. Because, like you said, it's not actually acceptance. The heightened visibility of bi women in the media hinges on fetishization, and which causes real world consequences in the form of sexual violence, which, statistically 75% of bi women have survived. So, like, I think it gives like an opportunity to look at all of these intersections and to make the connections.
Absolutely. And I think having attention to those intersections is what makes your work so crucial today, because it's not trying to separate bisexuality out from those things. It's seeing things through bisexuality, but seeing the way that intersects with other forms of identity, but also social power in the real world, which is something that is part of a kind of leftist tradition of thinking through identity not as some abstract thing that has no effect on the world, but something that's incredibly important in terms of how we experience the world, how vulnerable we are in the world, how much power we have in the world. So yeah. I'm wondering about the visibility thing that we touched upon. I know that you've been doing some research into bisexuality in television, and I'm sure a lot of those questions around bisexuality and representation come up there. And I wanted to ask you, just as a kind of starting point, how you kind of set out to approach questions of visibility and representation, because they're words that we hear a lot about, but people can use them in different ways to mean different things. So So what do those terms mean to you? Kind of bisexual visibility, bisexual representation.
It's complicated actually, because I think the concept of bisexual visibility is definitely not enough. I mean, it is literally the bare minimum, and the fact that it's such a buzzword and such a, long long time request, demand, um, from the bi community to, the media, to just show us, to just acknowledge that we exist, is just, we deserve so much more than that. And, I think about myself, like, in before I started, like, thinking about this more seriously, and I used to see, bi representation in the media and get so excited that it was bisexual that I didn't even notice how negative the representation was. Like,
Right,
how,
right.
like, oh my God, there's a person who's bi. Um, they're represented really, really horribly, but oh my God, they showed it. Yeah, so, like, the concept of visibility is very limiting, but also the concept of, quote unquote accurate representation, which I think a lot of the time is a euphemism for respectability. Jacob, you wrote about that, and yeah, it was really weird. Reading your article was like reading the introduction, chapter to my thesis, which I wrote.
I
Like,
mean, it would make sense because you kind of sparked my interest in this stuff. So that's
yeah,
amazing.
it's about the assumption that there is an objective and unified reality to all bi people, that we all share the same characteristics and the same behavior, and that behavior has to be respectable. And, and representing that is the only kind of acceptable bi representation. And I think, that kind of view really centers, non-bi people, because, it focuses on the question, what will people think about us, and not, where can we see ourselves. I don't see myself in respectable bi characters. I don't see
Yeah.
myself in many bi characters, actually, that I've seen. But the few I have, it's often been the villains or the weirdos, or, those on the margins. And, there's a thing where, we always have to read ourselves into the margins. I think it's a very quintessential bi experience, that, like, we have to read into things in order to find ourselves in a way that, and it's an experience that repeats itself throughout our lives. We have to, like, forge our own path.
I think in that sense, it's kind of an insight that it gives us, the kind of the difficulty in seeing bisexuality in cultural products kind of can give us an insight into the kind of falsity of the claim for for representing sexuality in the first place as well. That the idea that any sexuality could be represented is something that I think is a flawed premise as well. Um,
Absolutely.
and the other thing that I was thinking about is the kind of in these conversations around visibility and representation, often like I 100% get the kind of rush that I definitely felt growing up and can still feel today when a character calls themselves bi in something. But at the same time, as someone with a background in film studies, I think that is such a kind of limiting way to think about what sexuality is on screen if it's down to a character saying a word. The kind of early queer film theorists were like invested in some really straight films, but they what they loved was reading them against the grain, seeing in this villain something that they felt inside of them, reading this glance between two characters in a perverse kind of way. And I feel like there's actually, even though that is kind of the product of kind of social marginalization, there can be a great pleasure in that kind of reading against the grain that we can do as queer people. And that's not necessarily something that I want to let go of.
Yeah, nor should we. But I mean, given broad culture of bisexual erasure, I don't think, I don't think we're going to have much problem with sticking to it. But I actually like the characters say the word bisexual. It's only been happening over the past 5 or 6 years. And that's amazing. A few years back, it was Grey's Anatomy, the first time that a character said, "I'm bisexual" in a prime time television series without saying, "I'm not" first or watering it down later. And that has its limitations. I don't think that should be like the extent of our hopes and demands from media. But it still, it makes me happy. I think it's a good thing to be able to speak the unspoken and the unspeakable.
Well,
um
yeah,
yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, like, and like I understand too that that's the bare minimum in representation, like to have bi characters that exist, and like we deserve so much more. But it's even been so hard to do that, like the Grey's Anatomy thing. I can't imagine how hard it was because I worked at Law and Order SVU on NBC, and like when I was first starting there and I was not out, there was a character who was married to a woman with kids, and he would go out at night secretly to have gay sex, and like that character was gay. There was never even a discussion in the writers' room. Could he be bi? He was just gay. So even just that bare minimum is like for a network primetime thing is difficult, but hopefully getting a little better.
Yeah, and I think, a lot of media, especially TV shows, are only now beginning to try and find the language with which to represent bisexuality. Because, and I mean represent even like, down to the, cinematography and construction of how it's represented. Because so many years, bisexuality has been impossible or incomprehensible within, media texts. Like, a thought that I had while I was writing the introduction to my thesis was that the general rule for representing bisexuality was that it had to comply with Plato's three unities: the unity of time, the unity of place, and the unity of plot. So, like, a person can't be bisexual if they're not, involved with people of quote unquote both genders, because it's always so reductive, at the same time, in the same place, and within the same narrative arc.
Right.
And I think we're starting to see some representation that takes the, that complicates that a little bit and makes bisexuality comprehensible even outside of those three unities, which is, it's great. I really hope they continue to do that and that we see a lot of good things.
And thinking about those kind of constraints that can be on bi representation, I pulled out a quote from Maria Sanfilippo, who is a bisexual film and TV scholar. And for her, television is a format that maybe offers ways of telling bisexuality in a more complex fashion. So the quote from her that I want to share is, the narrative open-endedness and expanded time frame that characterize serial television drama offer a particularly promising site for mounting long-range and multifaceted explorations into bisexual characters, identities, and experiences. Do you agree with Filippo there, Shiri? The kind of the longer kind of serial structure of television can kind of open up possibilities for more complex stories that are more suited to bisexuality.
I think it opens more opportunities for the viewers to read it as bisexual. I mean, I'm not sure I would give, a lot of media the credit of intentionally leaving it open-ended, and open to interpretation and multiplicity. I think that would be, it's a spectatorship. Like it's a practice that we engage in while reading the text actively and often against the grain. And there are so many
Mm,
examples for that. The quintessential example is Willow from Buffy.
right, right.
And, we can definitely read her as bisexual, but it wasn't intended to be like that by the text. So I do think, the format of television series can give more room to that kind of reading. But
Mm.
that reading is ours and we get the credit for that.
Yeah, and I don't necessarily see that as kind of less valuable, or I have a real kind of affinity with the idea of spectators creating meaning. And I think the kind of
Mm-hmm.
flip side of that can sometimes be a very narrow set of expectations for representations that don't allow people to engage with film or television in a more creative way. That we don't need someone to tell us, yes, you can call this character bi. We can just feel these things. We can read into in a similar way that people don't tend to watch films made before the 90s when looking for like queer representation, when there is so much there to unpack. And even in the early decades of cinema in the early 1900s, I mean, there's a lot there that lends itself to these questions, but it involves approaching them a little bit differently as well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
What series have you been looking at in particular, and are there any series that you wish more people had seen?
Okay, those are two very different questions because
Oh yeah.
two very different answers. Um, I've actually been watching a lot of like series with explicit biorepresentation lately. So I just finished watching Hacks,
Me too.
which is it's a comedy show by HBO, focusing on a young comedy writer who starts working with an aging stand-up comedian, and the character of the writer is bisexual, and she says it, which is great.
A
She
bunch of
she
times.
says she also says monosexist, and
Oh
like
wow.
that's the first time I've heard that on television. That was exciting.
Wow.
Um, I also watched Trigonometry, which is a series I think produced by the BBC. Maybe it was something from the UK anyway, about a triad. Focuses on young woman who comes to live with a young couple, and they fall in love and form a relationship,
Mhm.
which was a very, very promising premise. But I found it kind of disappointing in terms of. I've actually been thinking about this a lot, and maybe I'll write about it someday, about how the convention for representation of bisexual triads is that it can never work, that it's impossible, that it has to be like undone in every second that it's represented, which bothers me. I also watched Feel Good, which is a show by Mae Martin, who's also starring it. There are 2 seasons. The first actually is kind of about bisexuality without ever acknowledging that. And in the second season, they say bisexual twice in one episode or in 2, and I was like, oh my god, that's unprecedented.
Maybe they were reading your tweets after the first season.
Unlikely. I watched both of them in one go. But yeah, I think, I have a lot of thoughts about these texts, and they're kind of complex because every representation has its limitations, and like, I think, I have never in my life seen 3 whole series. Was that 3 or 4 that I just talked about?
It was 3.
Maybe. Okay, so I also recently started watching The Bisexual by
That's right, Akavan.
Yeah. I'm only I'm only at the second episode now, so I'm not sure yet what I think about it. But I have been seeing a really strong tendency to depoliticize bisexuality within those representations. And so, I think, representing named explicit bisexuality has opened a lot of possibilities, and it definitely is a new thing that I'm happy to see. But also, we always have to maintain our critical lens and practice, so we don't, we should always ask for what we deserve and not, just live with the scraps. And I think right now it's kind of like scraps. I want richness.
Can I ask, what is that related to what you mean by these shows depoliticizing bisexuality? Like, what would it really look like to have a politicized version of bi-ness in TV?
That is a really good question.
I'll do whatever you tell me. I'll work on it in my pilot. Can you two be my technical advisors for my series when it goes on? No, I'm just curious, like, what makes you say that about those shows, that they're depoliticizing it? I'm not exactly sure what you mean.
By depoliticizing, I mean I felt they were trying to disconnect bisexuality from social context. For example, most of those shows featured bisexuality without acknowledging the existence of biphobia, which, it completely detaches bisexual experience from the very concept of what it means. And and that is a very, very common trope in the media. I have never seen biphobia represented as biphobia. Bisexuality either comes just like as a the disembodied notion of human sexuality or whatever, or disconnected from oppression and social implications, or biphobia is represented as truth.
Right.
So, you get characters saying like really, really terribly biphobic things, and the way they're represented is, oh wow, that is so true. They are really calling this person out.
Yeah.
So like these shows, I don't think were doing the biphobia as truth thing, but they were definitely representing bisexuality only as a form of attraction, and not as and experience in the world.
That makes so much sense because I see all these shows like the conflicts for the bi person usually come from the fact that they're dating a man and a woman at the same
Yeah.
time, right? And for me, most of the conflicts in my experience as a bi person are people throwing bi-phobia at me or internalized homophobia. And you're right, that's not where the conflict usually comes from on these shows.
Yeah. Or, there is a lot of internal conflict that we experience as well, but that is, also affected and often constructed by what society teaches us about, what's possible or impossible for us.
Right. Yeah, totally.
And characters are never shown dealing with that. It's just like, oh, I just love people,
Yeah.
as if it
Yeah.
has no, it's not rooted in lived experience.
Right, as if it's easy to get to that point. Like I know people that say that. I love all people, but like it takes some work to get
Yeah.
there and get through some biphobia. Yeah.
Yeah, and what obstacles do you come up against if you want to live like that? That's an important question as well.
Yeah.
My memory of it is not great, but around a year ago, I discovered a British TV show from 2001 called Bob and Rose, and it's not the best TV show ever, but the whole premise of it is a gay identified man kind of falls for his female friend, and this kind of leads to an identity crisis of sorts. And it was just very interesting to look at as something from what feels like a different time in terms of sexual politics than today, but that does kind of engage critically somewhat with biphobia within the gay community, but also the necessity of kind of queer community spaces for anyone who's queer. Um, so yeah, that was just a find of mine that I wanted to mention. I mean, Rob, do you have any kind of TV moments that kind of meant a lot to you in terms of bisexuality?
It's funny, like the hearing the word bi for the first time on network TV really like I didn't expect it to affect me the way that it did. But it was on Brooklyn Nine-Nine a few years ago, which is even more complicated because it's a show about policing that's kind of could be problematic because all the cops are the heroes, which they're now dealing with on the current season, which is also interesting. But when Rosa came out and said I'm bisexual, I started crying. Like I didn't expect it. She said the word. I couldn't believe it. And I thought they did a pretty good job with that storyline as far as a network sitcom can do. It felt pretty real. But yeah, like I also know what you mean about reading stuff into things that are not explicit or like connecting with those characters. I can't think of anything off the top of my head. Although I also loved the Hacks representation too because it was part of the story, but it wasn't where all the conflicts came from. But it just made so much sense to me that a character like that, especially with like her kind of progressive attitudes and radical politics, like with her comedy and the mission she had, I identified with her a lot, and so it made sense. And I also liked that she wasn't perfect, and there were things she did that I was like, "Oh fuck, don't do that. That's messy."
Yeah,
Yeah,
I really enjoy the new trope of the messy bisexual. I think
yeah,
it's very human. It's very humanizing, and it allows us to acknowledge that we're not always palatable, but we still deserve recognition, liberation, compassion, to be to be seen as human. And also what I liked about Hacks was the fact that the main character was both bisexual and humanized, and her bisexuality played part in her arc, because that's not something I've really seen so far. usually in recent years, bi characters, bisexuality is matched with their level of, moral character. So, like, if they're a villain, you better believe you'll see a lot of bisexuality there, and it will be very prominently displayed as part of their villainy. If the character is morally gray, likewise, they're gonna show you their bisexuality to tell you that they can't necessarily be trusted. Um, and if the character is humanized and represented as somewhat of a protagonist or a positive character, then suddenly their bisexuality doesn't matter. They're bisexual, but we're not gonna see that because it's only part of their personality, and it doesn't have to be the center of their lives. And like, it's not part of their lives at all, the way you're showing it. And and what I liked about Hacks was that it totally did something different there. Her bisexuality was absolutely part of the plot. Things happened that directly related to that, and she was humanized at the same time. That was great.
Right, it was part of it, but it wasn't like, will she end up with a man or a woman? Like, that wasn't the story, but it was like still
Yeah. I mean, I
built
still
in.
want to see specifically bisexual stories. Because a lot of the time people say that they want to see normalized bisexual characters, characters whose bisexuality isn't the focus of the plot. And they're just like basing this argument on a very erroneous presumption, because the convention for the representation of gay and trans people was indeed to focus the plot on the tragedy of their existence, the tragedy of their homosexuality or transness, and pathologization, villainization, through direct storytelling of their sexuality and gender. But bisexuality was never represented through that convention. We have never seen stories that focused on the tragedy of bisexuality, because bisexuality was never perceived as a cohesive inherent quality the way that homosexuality or transness are perceived. Bisexuality has always been perceived as transient, ephemeral, vague, not really existing except for time, place, narrative arc. So I do definitely want to see specifically bisexual stories about being a bisexual person in the world, and how that specifically plays out in many ways. I think the bisexual probably does that, but I'm not far enough to really know there.
I think the bisexual does it. I liked it in that it felt very real and like it was her experience or something, some version of her experience. So it didn't encompass every bi. It was like one bi experience, but it felt very real and authentic to her. And I think I agree with, like, we can do both things at the same time. Like, we can normalize bi people and bisexuality and also tell stories about the struggles of coming to terms with that or coming out or whatever. And like, so many people who listen to this podcast have written into us about, like, bi men who are married to women is a big demographic on this show, and a lot of them have come out to their wives after they got married, or are not out to their wives, or like, or it was an issue before and now it's not. And like, that's what I'm writing pilot about. That, like, those are the kind of stories I think we haven't seen, and we can normalize and humanize those characters while at the same time showing that struggle.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, I wanted to mention a series that I would want more people to watch.
Oh yeah,
Um,
please.
it's Penny Dreadful. Do you know it?
I've heard of it, but I
Yeah.
haven't seen it.
Oh my God, you really have to. It's and I'm talking about like the first series, because there was a second, Penny Dreadful City of Angels, which was not at all the same. Though its representation of bisexuality, I am amused and disappointed and delighted to say, remained the same. Bisexuality as a marker of evil. So
Well, I think
the first series, Penny Dreadful, is it's gothic horror in like the best way possible. It is so well written and so well acted. Also very, very white, I should say, but but very Victorian in its, both in its setting and its aesthetics. There's so much bisexuality, both explicit and to read into. Um, and I do love that it's a marker of evil within that show. It's
yeah.
it's a marker of all the demonic powers lurking to to go and destroy humanity. I fucking love it.
I love it. Yeah, that
because
sounds
I
great.
mean,
yes, I want to destroy the world.
I mean that's kind of a very central argument for your work, is not to deny those bad stereotypes on in inverted commas, but to see in those the threat that we can pose the status quo.
Yeah,
And I
it's
think
so
that,
powerful.
and
I
that's
want to
why
have
I
that
like,
power. We do
yeah,
have that power. That's why
absolutely.
we're being cast as those villainous, demonic, destructive beings.
Mm.
And
No,
like, yeah, that is amazing. It makes me happy.
so that was the first half of our interview with Shiri Eisner, but worry not, there is plenty more to come in our next episode, where we will be touching on some slightly different subjects. We will be talking more about identity and how that intersects with politics. Shiri, Rob, and I are all Jewish people, and we go into basically how our Jewishness and our bisexuality might interact with one another, how they have historically in our lives, and how they might inform our politics. And we get a particularly interesting insight into Shiri's work as an anti-Zionist activist living in the state of Israel, which is fascinating and something that we don't often hear about. So please do tune in next time for the second half of our interview with Shiri Eisner. I'll see you then.
Two Bi Guys is edited and produced by me, Rob Cohen, and it was created by me and Alex Boyd. Our music is by Ross Mincer, our logo art is by Caitlin Weinman, and we are supported by the Gotham, formerly IFP. Thanks for listening to Two Bi Guys.